Welcome to Dr. Amanda Clarke, Heart Health and Cardiology. Today we are talking about why young Americans are having heart attacks at rates nobody predicted, and the real reasons behind a crisis that the medical community is only beginning to fully understand. Let us get into it. I want you to think about someone specific right now. Not an elderly parent or grandparent, someone young, someone in their 30s or early 40s, someone who works out sometimes, does not smoke, has never been told they have a serious health problem, and who the people around them would describe as basically healthy. Now I want you to hold that person in your mind while I tell you something that a major study published just this year in one of the world's most respected cardiology journals found. Heart attack deaths among Americans under the age of 55 have been rising, not falling, rising. In a country with access to the most advanced cardiovascular medicine on Earth, in the age group that should be the furthest from cardiac catastrophe, the trajectory is moving in exactly the wrong direction. The percentage of heart attacks among Americans aged 18 to 44 rose by 66% in just 4 years between 2019 and 2023. 66% in 4 years. Among adults who should, by every traditional measure of cardiovascular risk, be nowhere near a heart attack. And the story of why this is happening is one that every American under 50 needs to hear right now. Today, I want to take you through the full picture of what is driving this crisis, not the oversimplified version that blames young people for not taking care of themselves. The real and complete picture that includes the biological mechanisms at work, the environmental factors that most people have never connected to heart disease, the way that the modern American food and lifestyle environment is creating cardiovascular damage in bodies that are far too young to be experiencing it, and the specific warning signs that are being missed in this age group at rates that are costing lives. Stay with us until the very end because the final section of this video contains the most important prevention information for people under 50 that we have ever covered on this channel. Let us start by establishing exactly how significant this problem actually is, because the data tells a story that is considerably more alarming than most coverage of this issue has conveyed. Heart attacks among young adults have been increasing by approximately 2% every single year for the past 2 decades. Every year, consistently. In the age group where cardiovascular disease should be declining, a study that followed more than 2,000 young adults admitted to hospitals for heart attacks between 2000 and 2016 found that 1 in 5 of those patients was 40 years old or younger, and critically, the proportion of young patients in that group was growing by 2% annually throughout the study period. Young adults who experience heart attacks are just as likely to face severe complications, including heart failure and death, as older patients. The heart does not know how old you are when it is deprived of blood flow. The damage is the damage regardless of the age of the person experiencing it. The American Heart Association published research this year that added another dimension of urgency to this picture. By 2025, nearly 1/3 of women aged 22 to 44 are expected to have some form of cardiovascular disease. Diabetes in that age group is projected to more than double from 6% to nearly 16%. More than 1/3 are expected to have high blood pressure, an increase of more than 11%. And if current trends continue, the American Heart Association projects that 60% of all American women will have cardiovascular disease by 2050. These are not projections for a distant future. The cardiovascular risk factors that will produce those outcomes are being established right now in the bodies of young Americans who have no idea this is happening to them. Now here is what most people never find out. The new research is revealing that the causes of this rise in young adult heart attacks are considerably more complex and considerably more disturbing than simply poor diet and lack of exercise. Though both of those factors absolutely matter, there are emerging contributors to young adult heart disease that nobody was talking about a decade ago and that have now been confirmed by research with sufficiently large study populations to make the findings impossible to dismiss. The first, and perhaps the most surprising new contributor, is cannabis. A pooled analysis presented at a major cardiology conference in 2025 studied 4.6 million people and found that cannabis users under 50 had a 6 times increased risk of heart attack compared to non-users. 6 times. Even among people with no baseline cardiovascular risk factors, normal blood pressure, normal cholesterol, no tobacco use. The cardiovascular risk from cannabis use in this study was completely independent of the other factors that typically predict heart attack risk. The mechanism involves cannabis's effects on the cardiovascular system, including increased heart rate, blood pressure fluctuations, and direct effects on the endothelial cells that line the blood vessel walls. As cannabis use has become more normalized and more widespread across the United States, particularly among younger adults, this cardiovascular risk factor has been quietly growing in prevalence at exactly the moment when young adult heart attack rates have been rising. The timing is not a coincidence. The research is saying clearly that cannabis and cardiovascular risk in young adults are connected in ways that the mainstream conversation about this substance has almost completely ignored. The second emerging contributor is vaping. A 2025 systematic review of the cardiovascular effects of electronic cigarettes found that even nicotine-free e-cigarettes caused acute vascular damage, including endothelial dysfunction, oxidative stress, and increased arterial stiffness. Think about what that means. The damage to blood vessel function that vaping causes is occurring not just from nicotine, but from the aerosol itself. Young people who switched to vaping believing it was a safer alternative to cigarettes have been exposing their cardiovascular systems to a different but still real form of damage. And because vaping became widespread among young adults who had no prior history of tobacco use, it introduced a cardiovascular risk factor into a population that would not previously have been considered at significant risk. And this is where it gets really serious, because there is a third emerging cardiovascular risk factor that affects everybody regardless of their personal choices. It is in the air you breathe. It is in the food you eat. And the research published in the last 2 years has connected it to cardiovascular disease in ways that are genuinely alarming. Microplastics. A landmark study published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2024 found microplastics in 58% of carotid artery plaques examined in patients undergoing surgical procedures. The patients with detectable microplastics in their arterial plaques had a 4.5 times higher risk of heart attack, stroke, or death over the subsequent 34 months compared to patients without detectable microplastics. 4.5 times from a substance that is now present in virtually every human body on Earth. A follow-up study published in 2025 showed that microplastics accelerated atherosclerosis in laboratory models without raising cholesterol, suggesting that the mechanism is direct inflammation of the arterial wall, rather than operating through the traditional cholesterol pathway. The cardiovascular implications of microplastic exposure are an area of genuinely urgent and rapidly developing research. And the full scope of the damage they are causing, in young cardiovascular systems, that have been accumulating them since birth may take decades to fully understand. Let me tell you about Marcus. He was 38 years old, a software engineer from Seattle, a man who ran 3 times a week, did not smoke, had normal blood pressure at his last physical 2 years earlier, and who had never been told he was at elevated cardiovascular risk. On a Thursday morning, Marcus woke up with what he described as an unusual pressure in his chest and a strange fatigue that he could not shake. He went to work. He told himself it was stress. By early afternoon, the discomfort had moved into his jaw and his left arm. His colleague saw him sweating in a way that did not match the temperature in the office and called emergency services. Marcus was having a heart attack at 38. The cardiologist who treated him found a significant blockage in one of his coronary arteries that had developed without warning and without any of the traditional risk factor profile that typically identifies someone at elevated risk. Marcus survived. He is one of the fortunate ones. But his cardiologist told him that what happened to him was becoming less and less unusual. That the patients in their 30s and early 40s showing up with significant coronary artery disease were no longer the rare exceptions they once were. Marcus's story illustrates something critical about why the rise in young adult heart attacks is so dangerous beyond the numbers themselves. It is dangerous because of how it is not being caught. The screening and risk stratification systems in American medicine have been built around the traditional risk factors for cardiovascular disease. Age over 45 for men, over 55 for women, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes, smoking, family history. These factors were derived from research conducted primarily in older populations. They do not fully capture the cardiovascular risk profile of a 35-year-old whose arterial walls have been accumulating inflammatory damage from a combination of ultra-processed food, vaping, cannabis use, microplastic exposure, chronic sleep deprivation, and the kind of metabolic dysfunction that develops silently over years of sedentary screen-dominated modern life before any traditional risk marker shows up on a blood test. The research actually shows that the single strongest predictor of death from a heart attack in young adults is not the traditional risk factors at all. It is income. A study found that low income was more predictive of death after a young adult heart attack than cholesterol or blood pressure. The reason connects to a cascade of factors that co-occur with economic stress: less access to quality food, more reliance on ultra-processed food, more exposure to environmental pollution, including air quality that is directly associated with cardiovascular damage, less access to regular medical care, higher chronic stress levels, worse sleep quality, and less ability to manage the modifiable risk factors that preventive cardiology focuses on. The cardiovascular crisis among young Americans is not happening equally across the population. It is concentrated in the communities where the risk factors are most densely clustered and the resources for prevention are most sparse. Now let us talk about ultra-processed food, specifically because its contribution to young adult cardiovascular risk deserves more direct attention than it typically receives. Between 10 and 14% of premature deaths in the United States are now attributable to ultra-processed food consumption, according to recent research. Ultra-processed foods are not simply unhealthy foods. They are industrially manufactured products that contain ingredients not found in home kitchens, including emulsifiers, artificial colorings, flavor enhancers, preservatives, and chemical processing aids that alter the behavior of food in the gut and in the bloodstream in ways that are distinct from the effects of simply consuming high-fat or high-sugar foods. The combination of ultra-processed food consumption with the other emerging risk factors we have discussed creates a cardiovascular risk environment in young American bodies that is genuinely without precedent in human history. Young people today are experiencing a metabolic environment that no previous generation faced at their age, and their arteries are responding accordingly. But here is the question nobody is asking directly enough. Why is this crisis happening now specifically? Not 10 years ago. Not 30 years ago. Now, the answer involves a convergence of factors that have been building for 2 decades, but that have reached a critical threshold at approximately the same time. The ultra-processed food environment has intensified dramatically. Cannabis legalization has expanded use across age groups that previously had lower rates of use. Vaping was introduced as a supposed safe alternative and rapidly captured a young adult market. Microplastic contamination of food, water, and air has been accumulating in human bodies since birth for the generation. Now in their 30s and 40s, chronic sleep deprivation driven by screen use has become normalized to a degree that has no historical precedent. Sedentary behavior, always present in modern life, was dramatically intensified by the COVID pandemic and has not fully reversed. And the stress load carried by young Americans navigating an economy of housing unaffordability, student debt, job insecurity, and the constant information overload of digital life is producing chronic cortisol elevations that have direct and measurable cardiovascular consequences. No single one of those factors is the cause. All of them together, interacting in the same bodies over the same years, are producing a cardiovascular damage burden in young Americans that is showing up in the data as a historic and alarming rise in heart attacks among people who should be decades away from this kind of risk. Now here is what the research actually shows about the warning signs that are most likely to be present in young adults who are on this trajectory before a cardiac event occurs. And this is the information that I most want you to take away from this video, if you are under 50, or if you love someone who is. The warning signs of cardiovascular disease in young adults are real. They exist. They are present before the event in the majority of cases, but they are being missed because they are different from the warning signs in older adults, and because the healthcare system is not adequately primed to look for them in young patients who present without traditional risk factors. The most common warning sign in young adults approaching a cardiac event is unexplained fatigue, not the tiredness that follows a difficult week. A persistent, unusual fatigue that does not improve adequately with rest, and that represents a meaningful change from the person's normal energy baseline. Fatigue is the most frequently reported cardiac symptom in retrospect by young adults who survive heart attacks. It is also the symptom most likely to be dismissed as stress, overwork, or lifestyle factors by both the patient and the healthcare provider. The second warning sign is exertional symptoms: shortness of breath, chest tightness, unusual fatigue, or dizziness during physical activity that were not present at lower levels of exertion previously. When the cardiovascular system is being stressed by developing coronary artery disease, the symptoms often appear first under exertion before they are present at rest. A young adult who notices they are getting winded at exercise intensities that were previously comfortable, who notices an unusual fatigue in the chest or arms during workouts that was not there 6 months ago, is experiencing a warning sign that deserves direct cardiac evaluation regardless of age. The third warning sign is palpitations or awareness of irregular heartbeat that is new, frequent, or accompanied by dizziness or shortness of breath. Arrhythmias in young adults are not always benign. In the context of developing structural heart disease, they can represent a serious cardiac warning that should not be attributed to caffeine or anxiety without proper evaluation. And the fourth warning sign, and perhaps the most frequently missed in young women specifically, is jaw, neck, back, or upper arm discomfort that seems to come and go without obvious explanation, and that is not clearly attributable to musculoskeletal causes. Women under 50 who are having cardiac events are significantly more likely than men to present with these atypical symptom patterns, and significantly less likely to be recognized as having a cardiac emergency in real time. The research published this year found that women ages 18 to 54 were more likely than men of the same age to die after a first heart attack. Part of the explanation for that disparity is the delay in diagnosis that occurs when atypical cardiac symptoms in young women are attributed to non-cardiac causes, before the cardiac cause is properly evaluated. So what do you do with all of this information? The most important thing is to take your own risk seriously regardless of your age. If you are under 50 and you use cannabis regularly, understand that the research now says your cardiovascular risk is meaningfully elevated by that use, even if every other risk factor you know about is normal. If you vape, understand that the research is clear that vaping is not cardiovascularly neutral. If you have been experiencing any of the warning signs we described, unusual fatigue, exertional symptoms, palpitations, atypical pain in the jaw or neck or arm, please do not dismiss those symptoms based on your age. Age is not a shield against cardiovascular disease in 2026. The data is telling us that with extraordinary clarity, if you are under 50 and you have not had a cardiovascular risk assessment that includes not just blood pressure and cholesterol, but a conversation about the full range of your lifestyle, your stress levels, your sleep, and yes, your substance use, have that conversation with your doctor. Ask specifically whether any of the emerging risk factors we discussed apply to you. The healthcare system will not always raise these questions spontaneously. You may need to raise them yourself, and raising them could be the single most important thing you do for the next 50 years of your cardiovascular health. Your heart does not age the way you think it does. It ages the way you live, and the way young Americans are living right now is producing arterial damage that is showing up in the emergency room data with a frequency and at ages that should alarm every one of us. The trends are not inevitable. They are driven by specific, identifiable, modifiable factors. And changing course is possible for every individual who understands what is actually happening and makes the decision to take it seriously. If this video gave you a genuinely clearer and more complete understanding of why young Americans are having heart attacks at rising rates, what the emerging risk factors are that most people have never connected to their heart health, what the warning signs look like in this age group, and what you can do to protect yourself. Subscribe to Dr. Amanda Clarke and turn on notifications so you never miss a video that matters for your health. And drop a comment below answering this question honestly.